Time this weekend, then I'll have them for you by Tuesday. In the meantime, we'll keep powering on. So you've read for today, hopefully, the piece by Tesson again, in particular the part on the doctrine of effective political control I asked you to look at, and just a couple of pages on Ben and Peter's old handbook on social and political philosophy and thought. The basic idea here is we're transitioning slowly from thinking about self-determination in the most abstract and theoretical way to the more applied topics. And our first topic will be intervention. So it's still fairly close to self-determination because we've seen that most theorists of self-determination think of self-determination as when it's a right, as something that gives you a right against outside intervention and so on. So we first have to see like what's self-determination about, what is it itself, so that it might apparently give you this right. So hopefully we have a bit of a sense of that. And so we can look at intervention now on its own and what the role of self-determination might be in there. So there are several views here that I want to discuss with you over these next few weeks. Anyway, we'll get to those. Today we're going to look at what is sort of the traditional old classical view on intervention, but also set up the landscape a little. So first sort of lay out what the possible views are, and then look at what the traditional or historically the dominant view was. That's not the view that's currently accepted by the most people. So we're going to get to that, but first get to the old view. All right. So just as a piece of background, when we're going to read Altman and Wellman for next time again on intervention, this will be useful. But this is generally sort of a background to the debate, at least the philosophical debate on intervention and sovereignty. Is that there is two ideas here, the intervention idea and the status of international law, or international criminal law in this particular case. And there's some tension between them. And how this goes is, well, this international criminal law, this is what Altman and Wellman talk about a lot. You'll see there I have a chapter on this. Chapter 4 in the book. It's a particular kind of international law. It's a set of international legal rules that are different from what your standard idea of international law is. Maybe the one that most people have in mind when they think about international law. The standard traditional old international law is sort of the law of treaties, right? Where you have one government and another government and they all send their representatives to some type of summit. They talk for a long time and then they draft some type of statement and it goes back to the legislatures, they ratify it, and then boom, international law, right? So that's usually called public international law, and that is the law between states, or between countries, between governments. The law that Altman and Wellman talk about is called international criminal law. It's quite different from international public law because whereas international public law just talks about the relations between states, so one state attacks another, what has gone wrong between these two? There's a violation of law, right? It's international law prohibits aggressive wars between states. So if there's a violation of that, that's a problem between these two countries and their governments. Now, international criminal law is quite different because it doesn't do the same as international public law, which is take states as wholes as the main agents or actors in international law, but it actually sort of starts digging below the level of the state as a whole, but looks at individual people within those states, in particular individual politicians or military leaders or what have you. So the tension that I'm going to come to is already visible there between those two types of law, because whereas the whole idea behind the traditional view of sovereignty is that countries should not be attacking each other and should not be interfering with one another. That's the old view. It's sort of an absolute non-intervention rule. And why is that? Well, because if they start doing that, all sorts of chaos will emerge. It's roughly the idea. We'll see the argument for why you might think that today, but that's roughly the idea. If you let states interfere with one another's internal affairs, it's going to be chaotic. And so we shouldn't have that. So states should just treat each other as these entities that deal with each other as whole entities, as states. And that's what international public law is about. Now, international criminal law is much more recent, and that's very different because now it starts looking at particular people. So think about the Yugoslavian conflict in the 1990s. Right? According to old-fashioned international public law, there's not much there to be done. Right? What was it? You had one old country, Yugoslavia, and it started breaking up. Right? It started breaking up, and so there were these internal fights, at least, until the rest of the world starts recognizing each of the parts as individual countries. What you have is one country which has an internal fight going on. And if it's an internal fight, then it's not a matter of international public law, because international public law only looks at conflicts between different countries. So it's just an internal affair. That was, by the way, Milosevic's defense. He said, the West, NATO, UN, you should butt out, leave us alone, because this is an internal affair, and legally speaking, it's protected by sovereignty. And historically speaking, on the old view, he had a point. It's not that. It is now. It's not that way anymore. Back then, it wasn't even the way. So he was bending the truth a little to protect himself. But anyway, in the traditional view, that was correct. Now, international criminal law, what that does is actually during or after, in this case, after the conflict is ended, it doesn't just punish whole countries. That's what old international law could do. Put a sanction on it or a penalty or some type of warning or something on a particular country. It actually punishes individual people within the countries. So Milosevic was actually arrested and brought to The Hague to stand trial at the International Criminal Court as an individual criminal, right? War criminal in particular. And that's very, very different from the old view, right? Because now we're saying after the conflict or even during the conflict, or in this case, after the conflict is over, we say that other countries now, or other institutions, can stand in judgment over what happened within a certain country. So in this case, in the Yugoslavian case, the country fell apart, but that's not always the case, right? So people have been indicted, even when the country didn't fall apart, just within one single country. If they commit genocide, for instance, another type of crime against humanity, you can be brought before the court under international criminal law. So there is the tension, right? You see the tension between, on the one hand, the old view that the sovereignty protects the country from outside interference, and on the other hand, international criminal law, which is rules that actually restrict people from doing things within their own country. Leaders like Milosevic or whoever it might be. Now, of course, here's another version of the tension, right, which is intervention, just as a definition. It's uninvited military action, so not usually by invitation of the government, but uninvited, so against the will of the government, by one or more states against another state for humanitarian purposes, usually to protect the people against what the government is doing to them, or to protect the people when a government is failing to protect them from what other parts of society, groups, warlords, what have you, might be doing to them. So the question then is, well, state sovereignty is the state's legal right against outsiders interfering, especially through uninvited military action. So how might these things like international criminal law and humanitarian intervention be possible, or justifiable, or lawful? That's roughly the stuff that we're going to be talking about the next few weeks. All right? Okay, how does this tie into with self-determination? Well, the idea of state sovereignty, right, if you remember from Altman and Wellman, the way they talk about it, but it's very common, is the right to self-determination of a country is the grounding of the right of sovereignty. Right? So usually they're thought of as almost exactly the same thing. State is sovereign because it has a right to self-determination, or to protect the people's self-determination, and so on. Certainly how Walzer talked about it. All right. So, back to the international law, right? So, international public law. Here's the basic legal definition of a state, or a country, if you will. State is the legal term. So, the state, as a person of international law, should possess the following qualifications. First, a permanent population. Second, a defined territory. Third, a government. And fourth, a capacity to enter in relations with other states. This is your standard legal definition of a state. as a matter of fact, this is sort of used as a sufficient condition, right? So it basically means that anything that has these traits counts, roughly. Not quite, but roughly. So, what do you need to become a state, right? Well, you need a piece of land, right? You need some people in that land, right? So maybe the Antarctica probably won't work, right? If you can capture that. Then you need some people bossing those people around, right? That's the government. And then you need to have those people, talk to other people who are also bossing people around somewhere else, right? So other states. If you can do that, so it's a very bare bones definition of a state, right? So you create some type of government within a piece of land where the people live. Done. As long as it's sort of more or less stable, you're going to be counting as a state. Now, if you count as a state under international law, you're going to get all the protections that are afforded to states under international law, right? Including sovereignty, non-intervention, etc., etc. Other things too, we'll see later, like the ability to take out loans and so on with the World Bank, for example, things like that. Well, you get too, but for now, just the right against intervention, you get that. How? Well, not very. You don't need to do very much. I mean, this is hard enough, right? But it's a fairly simple, bare bones definition. If you remember the piece by Tesson, this is exactly one of the things he's railing against, right? Because what's not involved here, this is one thing that Altman and Wellman are railing against too. What's not involved here is any type of human rights or justice condition. You can achieve statehood under this definition by being atrocious. Right? So North Korea counts as a state. And so with all the rights and privileges that go with being a state. All right, so that's the traditional view, and we're going to look at that. But there's at least four different possible views. So if we can put them on a spectrum from least interventionist to most interventionist. Right? So from most protection to least protection against intervention. So here is the most protection. So the thing that allows for the least amounts of intervention is called the traditional Westphalian view. So it's basically all states, so everything that's a de facto state like this, will have full rights of sovereignty. And sovereignty means no intervention. You have a right against intervention. And for you history buffs out there, the Westphalian view refers to the Peace of Westphalia, which is in Germany. That's where the 30 Years' War was concluded. One of the most destructive wars in human history, still to this day. By many accounts, more destructive than at least the First World War. What happened there, right? The 30 Years' War was fought after the development of Protestantism. So you have these religious differences that growing within Europe between Catholics, people who Catholics and Protestants, different princes, each ruling their own country in name of God and the only true religion and so on. And they had different views, right? And because they had different views, they tried to, or at least use this as pretext, but at least the story was they tried to impose those views on people in other countries that were heretical in order to save their souls. Right? Here is this country full of people who are being governed by this Catholic king. I, the Protestant, I think like these people are doomed. We need to go in and save them. Right? And you invade, and then other Catholic kings might start thinking, well, wait a minute, I can't have that, so they start helping, and then other Protestants jump in, and before you know it, you have most of Europe fighting each other and going through, and there was tremendous amounts of destruction. The solution was, well, if that's what's causing the problem, these religious disagreements and the idea that one king is trying to impose his preferred religion on the king of another, or his preferred policies on another country, is you get absolute sovereignty. Sovereignty here means one king does not interfere, does not arrest around with the internal affairs of another. So you treat each other like separate entities. More or less like in accordance with what Tesson called the Hegelian myth, right? The country as a whole gets to make its own independent, autonomous decisions, and other people don't get to boss it around, don't get to tell it what to do, don't get to interfere or meddle with its internal affairs. Those are its decisions. As long as it doesn't attack anyone else, fine. So that's the most anti-interventionist you can get. Right? So rule of law says any country that doesn't attack any other country is going to be protected from outside intervention. So you can do whatever you want to your own people, right? As long as you don't do it to anyone else's people. That's more or less that view. That's not the state of current international law, by the way. It's not a view that too many people defend anymore, but that's traditionally, for a long time, for centuries, this was at least the nominal legal view. Okay, here's what Altman and Wellman, we'll see next time, call the consensus view. Roughly what current international law says. It's also what Walzer says, for example. Give or take. Somewhat in flux. Current international law is trending towards more and more interventionist, to the more interventionist side. But right now, this is more or less where it is. So the idea is that all states, everything that's like this, enjoys protection of sovereignty, unless there is like really, really severe stuff going on. Genocide, mass killings, these kind of things. Big civil war, ethnic cleansing. When you have the really severe bad stuff happening, that's when the rights of sovereignty start weakening or maybe disappear altogether, and then outsiders can start intervening. So think about Syria right now, right? So Syria, under this view, would have sovereignty until the fighting got so bad that we have things like it's been recently, at least under the standard view. So now there is actually there's been for a while now outside intervention going on, but that's okay, according to the consensus view, the current international legal view, because things got so bad that the protections of sovereignty were lost. Okay. But things have to get like Syria levels bad, right? So hundreds of thousands of people dying. That's the levels of bad we're talking about.
And we're at the consensus view right now, right? As in current.
Excuse me?
I said currently we're at the consensus view, right?
Yeah, that's the term that Altman and Wellman use in their chapter. You'll see them talking about the consensus view. So consensus view roughly meaning sort of general agreement, right? So they think that's what most people believe in. And it is roughly what current international law holds. So that's similar to Walzer's view. So then third, if we get a little more interventionist, Altman and Wellman have a proposal. We'll see that next time, right? But that's a proposal to weaken or further move away from the old sovereignty theory further than where we are now, right? So we've moved from absolutely no intervention unless you attack another country. That's, you get to kill your own people without thereby giving up your right against intervention. Current international law doesn't say that. It says you get to do a lot of stuff internally, but you don't get to just start killing everybody. And if things get really bad, then you lose your right to intervention, to non-intervention. And Altman and Wellman want to go one step further, right? So they say, actually, that's not enough. It's not that it has to get super bad, like mass killings and genocide and so on, but rather, the rights of sovereignty are not the type of things that you have until you lose them by allowing or committing the most horrible of crimes. No, the rights of sovereignty are things that you kind of have to earn. You have to earn them by having a pretty darn good record of human rights protections. So things don't need to get nearly that bad for Altman and Wellman. They don't need to get nearly as bad as Syria before sovereignty is off the table. Tamir?
So, under that proposal, are they basically saying that as far as the right to sovereignty goes, you have to respect human rights, not as far as being considered a state? So they're not trying to change what the definition of a state is. They're just saying that in order to get the rights of sovereignty, a state has to respect human rights.
Yeah, that's probably right. It's the combination of two claims that causes what they consider the trouble, right? The combination is that definition of states coupled with the legal claim that all states are sovereign. Right? And so you could weaken either, right? You could say, well, only those, we could add another clause, right? So A, B, C, D, and then E adequately protect human rights, and otherwise you just don't count as a state. And then say, but everything that counts as a state has sovereignty. Or you could say, no, this is what states are, but legally speaking, not all states are sovereign. So they don't tell you which way would be the best way to go, but I guess it depends on what other work the concept of statehood does in the law. Right?
Would Altman and Willman argue that, like, Saudi Arabia doesn't have a right to sovereignty because, you know, under their, I mean, it's a theocracy. I mean, they have Islamic rules, and so, like, apostates are killed. Like, it's a regular thing. They're executed for leaving Islam, among lots of other human rights violations. Is, like, would they affirm that Saudi Arabia does not have a right to govern its own people?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a little tough to answer because they don't exactly tell you, right? Here's they fudge on this. They say, if the state adequately protects human rights, but they never tell you exactly what adequate is, right? So then we have to ask, well, is Saudi Arabia adequately protecting human rights? Well, we never told, right? So
you can't
you can
extrapolate from what they have said and apply it to that.
Well, I think the reason why they don't exactly give you a metric of like here is what counts as adequate is that they think they want to give you a rough theory that you can apply to international law to think about it yourself. And so you should ask yourself, what is a good condition of adequacy here? And then you can, if you like their theory, you can apply it and say, well, that's going to be good enough. So then you have to ask, is Saudi Arabia adequate in that regard? I expect that they would probably say no themselves. But you can interpret the theory in a different way and say, no, that's adequate means something worse than Saudi Arabia. But I mean, yeah, I tend to think if adequate is...
Yeah, I mean, that answers the kind of...
Well, it's supposed to be an open-ended.
That answers the question.
I think they purposely are making it slightly open-ended so that people with different views about what an adequate standard of human rights protection looks like can use this theory to think about international affairs. So it's like a variable in a math equation, right? Like, so you plug anything into adequate that you think fits, and then the whole theory works. Right? So now, what is their private position on adequacy? I think Saudi Arabia probably falls short of it. I think most sort of faithful interpretations of adequate human rights protections should say that Saudi Arabia would fall short of it. Now, whether you like, that means you start not liking the theory so much, or you start really liking the theory is a different issue, right? But yeah. When you're getting killed for changing your religious beliefs, it's hard to say that your human rights are adequately protected.
Yeah, I mean, that's just one of the numerous things.
Right.
Many.
Yeah, well, they have lots of people who are working in some sort of legalized slavery is probably too harsh, but not too far away from it. They're indentured workers, mostly Pakistani and Indian people, so who have to give up their passports to their employers and so on. So. Claudia?
Would, for example, their view on women be bad enough? Because, I mean, in the end, the women they still have a decent life. They're not allowed to fly, but that, for example, that doesn't hinder your decent life, and often women say that you have to have a decent life with human rights.
Yeah, of course, the driving is that's the one that jumps in the eye. It's a lot more than that, right?
Yeah.
Hold political office and things like that. Yeah. But well. I'm not sure. For one, I'm not sure because I don't know enough about the details of Saudi Arabia to confidently say something one way or another. But I think that's if we just stipulate for the moment as a thought experiment, imagine a country like Saudi Arabia in which women don't get to drive, no vote, no political office. But apart from that, more or less have their rights respected in similar ways to the rest. And the rest is not non-adequate, right? It's tough, right? Like, I mean, it's a tricky case. I think it's a gray area because on the one hand, you want human rights violations not to be, like, it's clear that it's wrong, I think, right? I think most people would agree that it's wrong. But human rights are not supposed to protect you from everything that's wrong, right? It's supposed to be sort of a core set of cases that's wrong in a particular way, especially severe, especially threatening, especially oppressive or something, right? Yeah, something like that. So the way that Altman and Wellman say it is like the condition of minimally decent lives. So is it impossible to live in a minimally decent life if you don't get to drive? Well, I guess it depends where you live, maybe. But I'd struggle to answer that question with yes.
Maybe more with like the vote. If you're not allowed to vote that way, you're not allowed to express yourself, and basically that your opinion is suppressed. So that would be against human rights. But I feel like the voting would be a human right. The driving, but just some other issues like if you have to have dinner separately or things like that.
Yeah, maybe. I care more about driving than about voting myself, so maybe that's maybe asking the wrong person.
With women, there's worse things than that. Like if a woman is raped there, then she's at fault, not
right.
Right.
So we were trying to, but we were trying to imagine this.
It's under. I'm not gonna just.
But we were trying to set up a thought experiment type case, right? It was like set that aside. So those would be very severe. Those would, on any reading, be very severe human rights violations. But if we set those things aside and we imagine a country in which that doesn't happen, but other things are still happening, there are plenty of philosophers who agree with you that the right to vote is a very serious human right. I struggle with if the condition is minimally decent lives. I mean, can I live a minimally decent life without having the right to vote? Well, actually, for the last 10-some years, I haven't had the right to vote in the places where I live because I'm not a citizen and pretty decent, right? So, yeah, of course, right? See, but anyway, that seems to me the intuitive thing to say. But I'm surely a minority amongst philosophers anyway. Yeah, the right to drive, I think, it depends where you live, right? If you live in, I think, yeah, well, New York, maybe the answer is yes, right? In Europe, maybe the answer, if you live in Arizona or Utah or something, the answer might start shading towards the no side.
Wait, what's the question?
Whether you can live a decent life without having the right to drive.
Oh, yeah, in New York, you'd be alright.
Yeah, right. So, but if you live somewhere in the mountains of Utah or something, it might be it's going to get a lot harder for you to just get to the shop or something. And right. So anyway, the reason why Altman and Wellman, I think, go for adequate and don't tell you is to try and avoid these type of nitty-gritty type discussions, and then allow us to think about it, where you think the line should be drawn, and then plug it into the theory, and then see. In any case, they are very clear that whatever adequate is going to mean, it's going to mean something more demanding than just not having genocide and mass killings and so on, right? So Syria definitely inadequate, right? But we get to inadequate before we get to Syria. All right, so we're getting more, right? So this is like total prohibition on intervention. Here's intervention only in the worst type of cases. Here we have intervention when things get bad, but not the worst. And then there's the fourth possible view. We won't talk about this, but there is actually people like Tesson actually and Wellman later when he wrote without Altman have said this. So there's some philosophers thinking about this now that maybe we should have what I'm calling nihilism about. So just do away with the idea altogether. So they believe that that no country ever has a right against intervention. So that doesn't mean that you can just go around intervening all over the place, because sometimes you just do more harm than good, and then you shouldn't do that. Right? It's just going to be a bad idea. But countries never have a right against that. Tesson has this thought experiment where he has this, I think we may have talked about it. calls it the green button experiment. So if you have a green button, it's similar like the water example that Walzer uses, right, with Algeria and Sweden. Tesson says, well, so imagine you have this green button. You could press it today, and there will be a human rights violation going on somewhere in a country that's adequately protecting human rights, but still violates some. Maybe the U.S., right? There's some police brutality about to go down. Now, you're Americans, but there's someone in Canada, right? Someone in Canada has the green button, and they press it, and it stops. Right? No one else is going to, there's no bombs flying, there's no collateral damage, right? It's not going to cause chaos all throughout, whatever. It's just, you stop the human rights violation. So can you do it? And he thinks, yeah, you can. Right? Wellman has a similar argument. And what they think is, what it shows is, well, there actually is no right to self-determination or sovereignty, because that was supposed to protect you once things got adequate against outside interference, but the green button is outside interference. And if you think you can press the Canadian can press the green button, then the argument goes you should just let go of this idea of sovereignty altogether. There's just a question of, can you do it in a safe way, like this magical button that doesn't exist, of course, or in an unsafe way, which is using armies and stuff. Well, then you don't do it, but that's just, it's not because of sovereignty or self-determination. It's because, well, people will get killed. That's the thing. Yeah. All right. Any questions so far? Okay, this is just the landscape, right? So these are the possible views and how they relate to the old, at least the old version of international law and the current version. What I want to do most of today is look at the arguments for the traditional view, and then next time we'll start going into Altman and Wellman and their arguments against this consensus view. All right, so 2 arguments for why you might be a old-style Westphalian absolute sovereignty person. One argument is the equality of states under international law. This is a bad argument, but it's a popular one. You'll see it sometimes, but I'm giving it to you just to illustrate the type of arguments you see. Lawyers make this argument a lot. So, central part of the rule of law is equality before the law, basically meaning people who are subject to the law have to be protected by the law equally. So you don't discriminate against women over men, because men and women are both equally subject to the law, and the rule of law as a principle requires that they be treated equally. Now, international law is not about you and me, but it's about states or countries. Now, states are the primary subjects, and so states must have equal rights under international law. But if states have equal rights, then either all states have a right to intervene, or all states have a right against intervention for the premise. But it's not true that all states have the right to intervene in one another all the time. Right? And so then it follows that all states must be immune to intervention. There you have that's a standard argument that you'll see people often use. Why should we have rights of sovereignty, non-intervention? Well, we can't have states intervening in one another all the time. This is roughly how the argument goes. States should have equal rights, and so we have to choose. Either we get to intervene in each other all the time, or they don't. Well, it's not true that we want them to intervene. Can't have that, so they don't. They don't have that right, so states are immune to intervention. It's the right to sovereignty. So, I said this is a bad argument. Why is it bad? Can you see?
Because it doesn't take human rights into account. I mean, human violations into account.
That's true. It does not, and that doesn't sound nice, right? It's probably a problem somewhere. But the argument leads to this conclusion, right? It's logically valid. So 1 is a premise, 2 is a premise, 4 is a premise, 5 is a premise. So if the argument logically follows from those premises, and you think it's false because it doesn't involve human rights, then we have to know which one of these premises, at least one of these premises have to be false. Claudia?
Well, I number 5 that they just state it is false that says that you can't intervene. Like, I don't know where they get that from the rest of the argument. Like, it seems to me that they just say that. That's just how it is. But there's no proof to how they came to that conclusion.
Good. That's true. It is just an assertion. Now, do you think it's that states have the right, that all states have the right to intervene in one another?
Not to like that extent, but I don't feel like that they don't have the right. Like there, to some extent, there is a right to intervene. It's something like humanitarian, like Hindu or something like that.
Good. Yeah, I think you're on the right track. Just have to state it correctly. So if I say it's not true that all states have the right to intervene in one another, do you agree or disagree? So think about the opposite, right? So let's say if you disagree with me, then you're saying the following sentence is true. Every state has a right to intervene in other states. Right. So you disagree with that, right? So then you say then you're agreeing with this, right? That's just the same as to say it's false that. Right.
But for me, there would be conditions to that statement. I would say every state does not have a right to intervene in another unless, and then.
Yeah, good. I'm going to get back to that in a second. That's where we need to be going. But Jason?
Kind of building on that, the whole thing seems built on the premise that rights are absolute. You either have all the rights all the time, or none of the rights none of the time. But there are times where rights are applicable and inapplicable. For instance, you have a right to self-defense, but you don't have a right to physical self-defense against a verbal assault. So in no way is your right to self-defense being infringed upon by saying you don't get to punch that guy in the face because he said you're stupid or anything like that. It's just that your rights don't apply in that moment. So it's possible for rights to apply at one time and not apply at others, but they're trying to say either it applies all the time or it never applies.
Good. And that's similar to what you had in mind, I guess, Claudia, or not? It's too much a black and white thing that we're saying.
Exactly. Like that there would have to be more conditions to it.
Right. Reggie?
I think I have to agree with him, the same that all states are immune to intervention. I don't think that any state can be immune to intervention in human rights. So number 6 would be one that falls.
Good, yeah, but logically speaking, it's like 6 is the conclusion, right? So 6 follows from all the things that come before. So we might disagree with 6, but the price of disagreeing with 6 is that you have to disagree with at least one of 5, 4, 2, 1. So that's the one. So the thought that's arising here is that there seems to be something in this argument pact where there is a false dilemma being sketched. Right? Either we have to. Sorry?
I didn't mean to interrupt, but I was just like, that's the case.
Yeah, so there seems to be that we're thinking about it in too black and white a thing. There has to be middle ground, right? There has to be a middle ground between either saying that that every state can just intervene within other states, or saying no state can ever intervene with another. Reggie, are you back in, or are you sitting? All right. I'm not sure. I don't want to pass you over. So, yeah, right.
I think the conditional number 4 is faulty. I think it's a false dichotomy. For example, you can have something that's equal. The very definition of the why, what gives a state the right to self-determination is if they, we've kind of talked about in class, if they're not violating human rights. Well, then if there's a state that's, that applies to all of them, that they have the right to self-determination if they're not violating human rights. But there is the case that some are violating human rights and some are not. So the ones that are violating human rights, even though they're all under the same criteria, they don't have a right against intervention, while the ones that are not violating them do have a right
good.
against it.
Yeah, so this fourth claim here tries to connect this false dichotomy, right, that we're railing against, which is either you accept that there's just going to be chaos internationally and anyone can intervene all the time, everyone can intervene all the time, or you have to go for absolute prohibitions where no one can intervene ever. Right? But that's the choice. And 4 is trying to link that up with this idea that, well, that follows because states have to be equal under the law. Right? And you're suggesting now, well, that's a mistake, right? This is just false. It's not true that if you accepted states of equal rights, then those are your only options. Because you can have equality under the law where it's true for all states that if they allow for bad human rights violations, something, then every state like that will become open to intervention. And so now you have three positions, right? You have the possibility that every state can intervene all the time. You have the possibility that no state can ever intervene. And you have the possibility that every state can intervene when things get really bad, right? And you could keep adding, right? Like in the spectrum before, we could say, or if human rights are not adequately protected. Michael, did you know?
Yeah, I was just going to say, this argument seems like it's all or nothing. You can either always intervene or
Right.
never have to.
Right, and that's bogus, right? It's not. It's very rarely. Sometimes things are black and white, but most of the time they aren't. Right? And when this argument is trying to sneak that onto you, that you have to choose between one of these two options, you have to ask: are those really the only options? And intuitively, we know quickly. Look, wait a minute, something sneaky is going on. Logically speaking, when we analyze the argument, what it comes to is, like Ryan correctly said, it's the premise 4 states that these are our only options, right? And that it follows from the equality of states. And that's not true. So we just say this is false, and if this is false, then we're no longer forced to accept the truth of 6, which means you're off the hook. Okay. Anthony?
Kind of reminds me of the last chapter thing where it's like A plus B equals C, like where like, yeah, this one thought over here, which would be A and B, and then whenever like they voted and C ended up being
Okay.
logical.
Right. Yeah, good. Yeah, that was the same idea, right? That there can be logical connections between propositions or IDs. Right? Yeah. And if there are, and you accept 2 propositions or IDs that logically lead up to a third, then you are rationally forced to accept the third. And if you don't want to accept the third, then you have to find either a gap in the logic or start rejecting A or B, one or the other. Right? That's how philosophical progress is made, right? You can show the connections between IDs and then figure out what you believe to be true, or if you believe the conclusion to be false, that maybe one of your initial assumptions was wrong. Right? So you go back and you think, well, wait a minute, I started out believing this idea about self-determination, but it leads up to something I don't like, or whatever. Right? That's how I think it went with Wellman. Right? So Wellman has changed his view from the view that we have in the book to this total rejection of sovereignty. And I think he's argued himself into it. Right? So he's seen that he started to get committed to, well, if I accept even this more revisionist idea of self-determination, I have to accept that when someone comes and has this, if this imaginary green button were invented and I could stop a human rights violation from happening in another country, I'd have to be saying that morally I cannot do it. It would be wrong for me. So he thinks it cannot be true, he thinks. And so then he has to go back and he has to change his views on self-determination and sovereignty because of these logical connections. So you learn, I guess. Anyone else? Okay. So here's related to this argument. That's the crappy version. This is the better version, even if a lot of people think it ultimately doesn't work. If you remember in Toussaint's reading, he starts talking about the Hobbesian argument. And Ben and Peters talk about this too. When we talk about sort of the unreliability of the lack of impartiality of interveners. And the same worry is underlying this argument. The worry is that unless we have absolute sovereignty, international politics is going to get completely destabilized. It's going to get extremely aggressive, violent, unstable. The best way to present it is by using a little diagram, very rudimentary form of game theory. But the idea comes from Hobbes. Hobbes first proposed this idea, and it's called the prisoner's dilemma. Have you heard of a prisoner's dilemma? Raise your hands if you have. Yeah, right. So 3, 4 of you. Does anyone want to try and give a quick shot what the prisoner's dilemma is? Yeah, Timur.
So there are 2 prisoners.
Yeah, usually they're arrested on suspicion of a certain crime, right? Right.
Arrested on suspicion of a crime. They're separated, and they're basically told to snitch on the other person. And it ends up being 4 different outcomes. The first person can tell on the second person, while the second person essentially says nothing. And that can be, vice versa. So either one says something, either one gives the other up, or says nothing. And the second possibility is that they both give each other up. Fourth possibility, that was the fourth one is that they both say nothing. Now, if they both say nothing, as far as punishment goes for them, it's very lenient. It's the most lenient they could get. If they both tell on each other, in a sense, then they actually get the worst punishment. It's essentially the amount. The other option is that one says nothing, the other says something, or vice versa. That's like the median area. One person will actually get off free, the other person actually gets time. And vice versa. But that's kind of it. Like it's just.
So, but what's the result going? Like why? Like so, the police will try to do this, right? Like they arrest two people who think together committed a crime, put them in different rooms, and they start interrogating them, right? And so, why? Like, what's the point of? You want to know what happened, right? So.
I'm vaguely familiar with this. Someone else knows more.
But you did a very nice job in like unpacking what the options were, and but why does it matter what these options are, and like how the punishments are related to the decision to talk or not to talk. Claudia?
Yeah, it kind of goes in like, or when you think about it, it would be the most rational thing you would think is that both don't say anything, because that way, for example, both get to go free. That would be the most rational thing. But what actually happens is that both say something, because personally for them it's the most rational to say something, because they would think, if I say something and my other person doesn't say anything, well then I'm going to get free, so good for me.
Right.
If I don't say something but the other person says something, then I'm going to be punished even more. So for me it's better to say something rather than not say anything. And so in the end both say something, which is, if you think about it, actually irrational. But for them, it's the most rational situation they can be in, and the
Right.
decision they can make.
Yeah, exactly. So that's because of the way that Tamir was laying out the options, right? The options are lined up such that for each of the suspects, it's in their own self-interest to rat the other one out. But that's true for both of them, right? So one rats the other one out if he's rational at least. The other one rats the other one out as well if he's rational at least. And so they both rat each other out, but now they're both screwed, right? Because they both are ratted out by each other, and they both go to prison for a long time. And that's it, right? It's not because they're stupid, right? It's because, yeah, exactly. That's Hobbes's. This is like, I mean, Hobbes is about as much of a genius as you'll ever come across. Anyway, it's the kind of author, if you keep reading him, it keeps amazing you how brilliant he was. But he's the first one to really see very clearly that bad things happen sometimes when people live together. The traditional idea is something like this, right? So you'll hear this in politics a lot, or like pundits will say these things. So Middle East is a mess, right? Like, well, why is the Middle East a mess? Pundit comes in, well, there's something in, they have a violent culture or something. Right? So like, all right, thanks. So basically they're saying the countries full of Middle Eastern people are a mess because the Middle Eastern people, there's something wrong with them. They're the violent ones, and they collectively bring about a violent country. Right? It's roughly. Usually it's a little more veiled than that, but that's the story. Right? Hobbes is the first one to see like that. I mean, that's possible, but often it's not the way it is at all. Anyone can be ending up in a violent outcome in a violent society, if only they are put in the right situation, or the wrong situation, I guess. Why? Not because they're violent or stupid or short-sighted or something, but precisely because they're rational. Right? And the prisoner's dilemma shows that. Like both people everybody wants to stay out of prison, And these are not stupid people. They're not like morons who said, well, if you here's a cupcake, if you rat the other one out, wait, I'll do it. Right? It's not that's easily bribed or something. No, it's because they're smart that they end up doing really badly. And this is generally the analysis in that people use nowadays to explain for certain environmental problems, for example. Right? So global warming is supposed to be a further example of this. Right? So you have different countries, and each country is in the same position as these prisoners. Right? Because even though for all of us together it's better if everybody cuts back on carbon emissions, so the world won't continue heating up, it's in the interest of each and every individual country to just emit as much as whatever, irrespective of what other countries do. Basically, the idea is if I'm the only one that cuts back and they all keep emitting, the world will continue heating up. So then I'm screwed. And if they all cut out their emissions and I continue emitting, well, then the world will not heat up. So it doesn't actually make a difference what I do. I should continue emitting. And that's true for everybody. And so everybody keeps emitting. And then together you end up with a world that emits too much. And so a lot of environmental problems work out that way. So the prisoner's dilemma works like that, right? Prisoners are put each in a room. They're both told, if you rat out the other one, we'll reduce your sentence. So if you're the only one who rats out the other one, and they don't rat you out, then they don't have evidence against you to convict you, and so you walk free. But the other one goes to prison, full time. Right? So it's terrible. If you're the one who's ratted out, and you don't rat out the other one, then you're the liar and the criminal, and so you go away for a long time. Now, if you're ratted out by the other person, and you don't rat them out, then you're the one who's in that position, right? So then you're really screwed. You go away for the longest time possible. If they rat you out and you rat them out as well, then at least you get the slight reduction. They have the evidence against you already, but now at least you get the slight reduction for ratting out the other person. Right? So the basic idea is this. Doesn't matter what the other person does. If they rat me out, I should definitely rat them out too, because then I get my sentence reduced. And if they don't rat me out, then I should still rat them out, because then I walk free. That's the basic idea. And so what happens is, well, it doesn't matter what the other person does, I should rat them out, and the other person thinks the same way, and so you rat each other out, and so that's why the cops actually separate people, and they interrogate them in different ways, so they start doubting themselves, right? I don't know what the other guy is saying, so I should look out for myself. You look out for yourself, you start singing. That's the basic idea. All right. The idea here that Hobbes didn't talk about prisoners and cops, of course. Hobbes was talking about a state of nature, basically the idea that you and I would be in this situation if there was no government, if there was no police to actually threaten us if we commit a crime or something. Then what happens? And Hobbes thinks that will lead to lots of violence. Why is that? Well, if two people come across each other in a state of nature, they have, roughly speaking, two options. Right? One is to leave each other alone, go about their own merry ways, cooperate, be nice, whatever. Right? Let's call it be nice. That's one option, be nice. And the other option is attack each other. Right? So what should you do? Well, you're wandering around in this state of nature, minding your own business. Oh, another person. Right? Two options, be nice or attack. Well, which one should you do if you're rational? Don't try to be nice, try to be think about it rationally. What would you do? Yeah. Why would you attack them? Why would you think that they attack you? Good, right. So you're thinking about, well, they have two options too, right? Be nice to me or attack me, right? So if they attack, well, then you better attack. Otherwise, you're just going to lay down and get killed, right? And if you fight, at least you stand a chance. You might get wounded, not great, but you probably get wounded, right? Not great, but okay. What if they're nice? Not for Hobbes, right? Hobbes says if they're nice, you should still attack, right? Rationally speaking. Okay?
Yeah, just because it makes more sense in the way that either way, if you attack, it's going to be a better outcome for you than if you don't attack. If you're nice, then, well, if they're nice, that's good, but that's probably not going to happen, so. Right.
Yeah, and so why should you attack the nice guys? Well, first of all, they're nice now. You don't know if they're nice tomorrow, right? So if you can take one out, take one out. because it's just, you can sleep at night, you know. Of course, they might pretend to be nice, and then as you go by, hi, then turn around and stab you in the back real quick because you don't see them coming, you know. They might look nice and not be nice, right? So you might be mistaken about them. All these things are possibilities, and you should take these into account, Hobbes thinks, rationally. So, if they're nice, well, you can't really take the chance that wait and find out whether they're nice or not, because you might be dead before you know, right? So you should attack, right? Just bird in the hand, I guess. Right? So if they're nice, attack. Now, if they're attacking, we already knew we ought to attack. So it turns out you don't have to wait to see what they're doing at all, because whatever option they choose, you should get in there. Right? And of course, they, if they're rational, do the same thing, right? They think about you, like, is he nice or is he an attacker? Well, if he's an attacker, I better start fighting now. Well, if he's nice, then better be sure, so I attack him now anyway. So it doesn't matter, I'm going to attack. And
So Hobbes is basically an irrational thinker, I guess? Because everything you said...
No, he's a super rational thinker.
Well, super rational thinker, but it's like, if I got to attack somebody with being nice, that sounds like it's irrational to me, but according to him, that's rational.
Good. Yeah, it's a great point. So this is why Hobbes is such a genius. Right? What Hobbes saw, and it's really hard to, like, once you see it, you can't unsee it anymore. Okay? But it's a real deep insight. Is Hobbes saw that, like, it's possible for collective, like, groups together, people together, to act in ways that are irrational for all of them. Like, everyone's worse off because all of us are fighting and getting harmed and killed and so on. It'd be much better if we all just were nice to each other. So as a group, we're way worse off. Everyone, collectively irrational activity, because we're individually rational. And that's the true insight, right? It's the group as a whole behaves irrationally because all the people in it are acting rationally, and that's the analysis, right? And once you see that, so that's the reason why. So, okay, there's a society that's really violent. Is this because the people are in it violent? Well, maybe, but it doesn't have to be. It might just be that they're in a situation where it's rational for them to not wait and find out what these other people are up to, right? So, if you're a Hobbesian and you look at a place like Syria or something, right, and you see all the violence that's going on, is it because they're just violent people? Well, maybe, maybe not. But if we were in that situation and there was no effective government anymore, you'd probably see all these groups that are vying for power and are looking out for themselves, and each of them has guns, right? And they don't seem particularly trustworthy or nice, right? So what should you be doing? Well, you should be arming yourself, right? And you might have to fight sometime, right? And that's how you get a big civil war going on. And it's not because these are all jerks or something. Surely some of them are, but most people who are in that situation start acting violently because of the situation they're in. And if you change the situation, they'll change what's rational for them to do. The situation will change too. Like, their behavior will change. So Hobbes thought the only way you can change this state of nature war, in which it's rational for people individually to collectively be irrational and have a horrible outcome, is you introduce the government, and the government has police, and the police says, if you fight, you're going to prison, I'm going to make it even worse for you. And so now people can afford to trust others, because they know, well, if he's rational and he attacks me, he's going to get arrested, going to go to jail, and it's going to be terrible, right? So I'm safe. And if I do get attacked and my stuff gets stolen or something, I can go and get it back, right? I don't have to risk my own life and limbs, right? So I don't have to get in there before they have a chance to get at me. I can actually take a step back. And if everybody does that, now suddenly we have peace. So for Hobbes, this is why we need a government, and an anarchy would be total chaos. And so, one last thing, right? So, and now if we move that argument to the international question, right, you can see how this goes, right? So internationally, is there a government or police? No. So you have all these states, these countries, and they are like these people in the state of nature. And if once they start thinking that others might attack them, it becomes rational for them to attack the others first, and now we have chaos, right? And so, well, then what we need to make sure that nobody fears being attacked, and so we need this absolute prohibition on attacks. That's the idea. Ryan.
I think I see an error in that in this argument, this kind of principle he's trying to bring out by these examples. And that is, what he's saying is what you ought to do in these situations, what the most reasonable thing to do would be that which benefits you the most. And I think that's the mistake. What you ought to do is what's right. So in the example of, the prisoners, it would go against their, self-interest. But the right thing to do would be, if the other person did do the crime, to say that they did the crime. And if they didn't, to not say it. And so, if that meant you go to jail, well, that's the right, you shouldn't have done the act. At that point, it's not, in the same way with the attacking example, what you ought to do is not attack. And that should be your default. Now, if someone attacks, you defend yourself at that point. But what you ought to do isn't necessarily what's in your best self-interest.
Good, yeah. So I'll say two things. One, Hobbes does believe that people will look out for their own self-interest. And so, right. So he says that might be what you might think that's what they ought to do, but it's not what they will do. And so you'll get the fighting one way or another. So that's one. But the other point, which is more interesting, is he also says, well, even if you're right that you should do the right thing and not just be selfish or rationally egoistic or something, right? Surely there are limits, right, to what the price of doing the right thing might be. And the price of doing the right thing cannot be death, right? Cannot be that we say, well, you shouldn't try to defend yourself preemptively, attack the other first before they attack, if the cost of that is death. You're going to get killed by it. If you're some type of Nazi camp commander who's murdering people, no, sure, you deserve to die, right? But if you're just a random person wandering through the state of nature, if I come by and say, hey, random person, here's my theory of morality. It says the moral thing for you is to do is never to attack anyone, and you realize that means you're going to die today, then that goes out of the window, Hobbes thinks. Hobbes, that's not realistic to ask, and it's not reasonable to ask. So, sure, we should do the right thing, but the very most important thing is always that is self-preservation. He thinks, morally speaking, you have the right to defend yourself. So, if the other person comes running at you with the axe, right, like with the club or maybe in the state of nature, right, then you can kill them. If the only way to stop them is to kill them, right? Right. So, okay, well, now you're in the situation where, well, we don't have time to find out, right? Because if we're going to start thinking, well, is this the type of person who might attack me or not, then you might be already dead. So, well, it's the same type of situation, he thinks. You should get in there before that's self-preservation. So he thinks if you accept the right to self-defense, the whole thing unwinds.
And you had your hand up, but I think I have a response to that too. So
who would do that? Like if you go, say you got two suspects, who would go in there and actually say, "Oh, I committed this murder. Let the other guy know"?
No, you rat out the other person, right?
You
say the other guy did it.
That's not. Is that what you say? Is that rational thinking to go? If we got two suspects and the police got two suspects, and say you committed a crime, I don't believe either or person is going to go and say, "Oh yes, I murdered him. Send me to jail and let the other person go."
No, you don't say that, right? What you say is the other guy murdered him.
Oh, okay.
Right.
I'm saying.
And the problem is the other guy is saying that you murdered him.
Yeah, but he was saying about, oh, you should just do the right thing and.
Oh, right. Yeah.
About doing the right thing. Nobody would do that. So it's like a point. I didn't understand the point.
But you wouldn't commit a crime. That's.
Yeah,
If
but were I to commit, that's enough to, show that principle isn't the case.
But for the argument, so Reggie's going to agree with Hobbes here, right?
Yeah.
Right. Because Hobbes is going to say whether or not it's the right thing to do doesn't really matter. What matters is that if we rely on this, all hell will break loose.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So you might be right about that. But Hobbes disagrees that at least in the state of nature, the right thing to do is to be peaceful because the price of that is death. Anthony, sorry.
Have you ever read The Art of War?
I've read pieces of it.
It's like The Art of War and some of the Machiavellian works and stuff. It'd be the opposite, where he's saying you should do it because it's the right thing to do. You got people like Machiavelli, which they're manipulative and they just want to get the upper hand. And their whole point in international works and stuff is they maintain that upper hand, even if that means crushing their enemies before they even have a chance to fight back. Like going ahead, like you were saying, as soon as the person comes up, these people just automatically attack to get rid of the enemies before they have a chance to even recuperate on anything.
Right.
So like people saying like you should do the right thing, like that's one person's belief, but you can't project that on other people, because most of the other people, in a rational sense, they're just out there for themselves and their family and stuff, and they're just going to attack whatever as soon as they get the chance, so they can maintain it upper hand.
Now, not to cut you off, but like on a different aspect, to agree with him, say, if somebody murders your family or murders your mother or something like that, then you might go in there and say, oh yeah, I killed him because he murdered my family. Now, would that be a well, I say self-defense, but that would be premeditated, I guess. So in that aspect, maybe you could not agree with Hobbes. And just then you could say I did the right thing because say he murdered my daughter or something like that. So
No, so it's true that there's a version of sort of rational self-interest that we're using here that may not be what most people think is the thing to live by, right? And may not be the thing that most people live by all the time. For now, it doesn't really matter too much. Although that's an interesting, important question, right? Because for Hobbes' argument to work in general, this type of prisoner's dilemma type of logic to work in general, what you need is for some type of rational self-interest to guide people's actions, right? Because that's going to set up the logic of the situation. But even in those cases, maybe that's true what you're saying. For Hobbes, only needs to say is like, well, when it's a matter of life and death, when we're actually fighting or not fighting, when that's the choice that we have, then most people look out for themselves. That's probably true, right? So, as a generalization, maybe there's a couple of people who would be like complete committed pacifists, but well, they're gonna disappear pretty quickly, right? So, all right. So here is a start. We'll finish with this. We've got 5 more minutes, so wait for it. Here is a way of seeing the logic of that. This is the game theory part. So you can just see, this is a little matrix. Just walk you through how to read this thing. Two parties, person A or B in the state of nature, or in our case, country A and country B, right? So two states. It's a matrix, 4 possible outcomes. These are basically the outcomes that Tamir was talking about in the beginning, right? So country A could attack and country B could attack, in which case we're in this little box here. Country B might choose to be peaceful, not attack, and country A would attack, in which case we end up here. If they're both peaceful, we're down here, right? And if A is peaceful and B attacks, then we're in this box, right? So there's just 4 possible outcomes. Each has a box of its own. Now, there are 2 numbers in each of these boxes, and they just represent how good is an outcome for each of the parties. And so just rank them from 1 to 4, right? So 1 is the best, 4 is the worst. You could do anything, right? You could flip it around. You could say, you could make it dollars, for example, in which case the highest number would be the best, but we don't do it. Here it's just, it doesn't matter, right? As long as you keep it constant. Say just number 1 is your number 1 choice, right? Number 2 is your number 2 choice. 3, 3rd, and 4th is your 4th and last, your worst possible choice, right? Outcome. Okay, so we're assuming that A and B are both rational, which means they'll choose 1 over 2, 2 over 3, 3 over 4, 3 over 4, sorry, 1 over 2, 2 over 3, 3 over 4, right? Just choose something better rather than something worse if you get the choice. So far, so good? Right? So, if they both attack, they both get their 3rd best outcome. So, pretty bad, right? It's only one thing that's worse. What's the one thing that's worse? Well, 4, which is here, so this number, well, I should have said that. Sorry, the left bottom number is country A, the top right is country B. Right? So if we both attack, country A gets the 3rd best outcome, country B gets their 3rd best outcome. Pretty crappy for both. Suppose that country A chooses peace to be peace and country B attacks. Right? This is like the sucker in the state of nature who walks on while the other one stabs him in the back. Right? That's the worst, because you're not even fighting for yourself, you don't stand a chance, you're dead. Right? So in this case, you're going to be just annexed, colonized, or something. So that's 4. That's your worst possible outcome. That's worse than just the war, where you might survive in the end, right? If harmed and impoverished and whatever. But this is just total annihilation. So that's the worst. And of course, the best is, well, actually, it's like being a colonizer, right? Now you have twice the amount of area. You have more income, more wealth, and whatever. Right? So now this is the best. And you don't have to worry about those people anymore. Right? You don't have to worry about them attacking you. So best possible outcome, purely rationally speaking, is you manage to attack the other ones and they roll over. Right? And the worst is to be the roller over. Right? All right. So if country A attacks and country B chooses peace, well then we're here, which is the worst for B and the best for A, right? Because now A is colonizing B, so A is bigger, safer, stronger, and 4 is annihilated. And then, well, they could both choose peace, which is 2 and 2, so that's their best possible outcome that they can enjoy together, right? Because here, it's one get the best one at the expense of the other one. Here, this one gets the best at the expense of the first one. But here, it's the second best. It's not the best possible thing that you could hope for, but it's pretty darn good. It's your second best. And it's the best of the 2 things that you can have simultaneously, right? If we're going to be all doing the same thing, then we're either going to be attacking each other or we're going to be not attacking each other. And if we have to choose between those, well, then everyone living together in peace is way better than everyone fighting all the time. Right? This is the intuition that I think Reggie was talking about earlier, right? It's like, wait a minute, if we end up fighting all the time, isn't that the irrational thing? Well, collectively, yes, right? Because we could all be better off if we are all peaceful. But the logic of the situation means we'll end up here. Okay, so why do we go through all this? Well, if you put it up this way, you can see why the logic of the situation makes us fight all the time. Think about it this way. A has one choice. Attack or be peaceful. So think about it this way. I am A. I only get to choose whether we're up by attacking. So whether it's this box or that box. I don't get to choose between those 2 boxes because that's up to B. Right? So A just gets to choose up or down. These 2 boxes or these 2 boxes. So what should I do, says A? Well, let's compare, right? Let's suppose that country A is an attacker. Should I choose up or down? Right? Up, because 3 is better than 4, right? Okay, well, suppose that country B is a peaceful one. Should I go up or down? Well, up, because 1 is better than 2. So A thinks I should go up all the time, which is attack. Doesn't matter what B does, I should attack all the time. And B has the same thinking, right? So, well, I only get to choose whether we're left or right. I don't get to choose up or down. That's A. So let's think about it. Let's say that A chooses up. Well, should I go left or right? Left, right? Because 3 is better than 4. Suppose that they go down. Should I go right or left? Left, because 1 is better than 2. So B thinks I should choose the attack column no matter what A does. A thinks I should choose the attack row no matter what B does, which means we're left and up, right? Which is attack and attack. There you go. We'll end up there all the time if we're rational. That's the basic argument. All right. So much for Hobbes today. We'll pick this up next time. Have a good weekend.